Hello, and welcome to Generation AI, the podcast where we demystify artificial intelligence in the world of higher education. I'm your host, Ardis Kadiu, and joined with me today is my insightful co-host, Dr. JC Bonilla. Hey, JC.
Keynote partner in crime.
Keynote partner in crime.
What a great week, Mr. Kadui. Ardis and I had the opportunity to call and keynote at the AI Engagement Summit. Incredible, right? And over 1,400 people registered. I think we saw in our session about.
I think it was over 1,600, something like that by the end of it. So yeah.
So, and then maybe 600 people actually joined our conversation. It was
over 800. Come on, man. You got to get our numbers over 800.
And I am 21 years old. So it was a nerd impact love fest. And for everybody who is following our conversations and they understand what we're trying to do, AI assistance, it's gonna suck in the air out of the conversation. And it's very evident that people wanted to hear from leaders like you and I, artists, how does this build up touches campuses, classroom, administration, faculty, students. And I think it was a really good 2 days. So good job, my friend. I thought your 10 tools to crush AI presentation was the best, in my opinion, even better than our keynote. And good for you, specifically because you did not showcase 10 tools. You kept on giving honorary claims to like 5 others. So again, I'm going to throw a crazy number, but it felt like you showcased 18 to 19 tools at least.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I think, I had honorary tools in there and I had 4-in-1 tools. And so, yeah, there was a lot for 30 minutes, but I think we're able to cover a lot of that. And so one of the questions that came back from this event, and as we got something around the feedback on the post, was around FERPA, and it came up a couple of times around potential explanations on, hey, my leadership team at my institution is afraid to use AI because of FERPA, or they don't know how to think about FERPA in relationship to the AI. And we wanted to do an episode today that kind of covers that. It's like, how do we think about AI, student data, and FERPA compliance? As institutions really embrace this AI-powered tools to really streamline engagement and student engagement, and admissions and marketing, there's really critical questions that arise. It's like, how can AI be leveraged while still maintaining strict compliance with FERPA? So that's what we're going to try to do today, to understand FERPA a little bit more, to the foundations of what that is, like what does it mean for AI-powered student engagement and tools, and then last but not least, it's like vendors, and like how do you think about data use policy for FERPA compliance with different vendors. And we're going to kind of wrap it up and talk a little bit about how Element ensures that full FERPA compliance. Obviously, we're a little bit biased, but because we live in this every single day, we can only tell you how Element does it, how we comply with FERPA versus any other tool that you might be looking at out there. So does that sound fair?
Super fair, and it's a really important topic out of a series of topics that will emerge around trust in AI. Artists, when we think about FERPA and many other things like FERPA, this is where not understand what AI does and doesn't do, just basically gives you the flag of I don't trust it. So I'm really excited that you're going to do this walkthrough. This is an upcoming blog that also I believe you're going to be putting out. And it's just giving friends and leaders the opportunity to demystify and really understand what it does and it doesn't do as it relates to this the important component of FERPA. And artists, I think, just to kick us off, good acronym, but how many people actually know what the acronym stands for? FERPA.
So it's funny because people just throw it out there. It's like, but FERPA this, FERPA that. And it's like people don't understand, or sometimes they don't really know. So let's start from there, understanding FERPA, right? So FERPA stands for, what do you think it stands for?
Well, to be, without reading, I'm reading right now, but I always thought that stuff was federal educational
Yeah.
And then I don't know what the R and the P stands for. But obviously, I'm right. I'm seeing it. So, but go for it.
So FERPA stands for Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, and it's a federal law that was enacted in 1974 that protects the privacy of student educational records and institutions that receive U.S. Department of Education funding. So essentially, this is a federal law that says that you, institution X, are supposed to protect the records of the students and privacy of the student records if you receive federal funding. So FERPA grants students or their parents, depending on kind of how old that student is and the age of enrollment status, if they're a minor or not, certain rights regarding their educational records and imposes obligations on schools to safeguard those student information from obviously unauthorized access and disclosure. So this is very important, unauthorized access or disclosure.
We know it from, hey, you can, if dad or mom calls, you cannot tell, how little Johnny is doing in class. You cannot come and basically tell them if they got an A or a B. If basically documentation that comes from the university, it's meant to the student, parents, and everybody needs to basically stay on their lane. So it has all those manifestations, and it stems from that aspect you mentioned right there. It's about protecting the individuality and the privacy of the student, right? Hence the family F, right?
Correct, exactly. And look, at the very core of it, if you want to simplify it, it's really meant to be. It was one of the earliest privacy acts out there, or privacy laws out there, and it really is meant to protect the student and their data in institutions because he has a lot of it. So you, as the individual student, nobody can look at your data, or the school cannot show it to other people without your consent. That's basically what it comes down to. All right. So under this FERPA student, the student data is classified as educational records, right? So that includes academic records, so things like grades, transcript, course enrollment, personally identifiable information, or what we call PII, such as name, student ID, date of birth, things like that. Disciplinary records, obviously counseling, those fall under disciplinary records. Financial aid and billing information, and student communications with advisors, faculty, and staff. So all of those are combined under what's called an educational record of a student.
That last one, by the way, it's sometimes is missed by many administrators, right? That it also includes the communication transcript trail of a student with, the ecosystem that the university has.
Exactly. So if somebody calls in and like you can't have you can't expose that information. So institutions are required to maintain control over student records and prevent unauthorized disclosure, right? And provide students with access to their own records and allow them to request corrections, meaning that if something is wrong, the student should have access, and they're supposed to know what the school knows. So having access to that is really important. And then last but not least, ensure that third-party vendors comply with FERPA if they handle student data on behalf of the institution. So it doesn't mean that you can't work with third-party entities, but it's just that they have to comply with a way to handle that data in a way that is compliant with FERPA. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute here. What does that really mean, and how does that work?
Great.
So, what that means in essence is kind of what does it mean for kind of this engagement tools or CRM or anything like that, or an AI powered tool. So we're going to take Element, for example, but compliance means that you have to ensure that student data, it remains protected from unauthorized access, meaning that only the school has access to it and the school's administrators have access to it, and essentially that's locked down. So nobody else can have access to it, employees or third party or other folks, things like marketing, you can't really sell that data and you can't do anything with it. That remains protected from unauthorized access. Is not used for unintended purposes. This is really important. So it's only used for whatever you bought that system to do. So if you working with Element to communicate with students or engage with them, handle applications. That's the use of data. If we go out and say, hey, we're going to have another business and we're going to sell leads, well, we can't use it for that purpose, right? That is not part of the contract. Is under the institution's control at all time. This means that the institution has access to it. They can delete it. They can modify it, and they're the ones who only see that data. The last is that it's shared only when FERPA allows. Example, under the school official exemption. So this is really, really important because, like, what does that mean? Like this FERPA generally requires written consent from the student or the parent before disclosing educational records. However, there is this key exemption for what's called school officials with a legitimate educational interest, which can include third-party vendors under contract. So to qualify, the vendor must be performing an institutional service for which the school would otherwise use its own staff, and the school must maintain direct control over the use and maintenance of the records.
Correct.
Does that make sense, JC? So it means
100%.
that the school is not, like can hire an external, entity or a vendor, and it's protected under the FERPA because of this exception, which is called school officials. So in practice, an AI service, provider can receive student data without individual consent only if it's designated as the school official in the formal agreement. So essentially the contract says that it has all the protections of what that means in the contract, right? And it ensures that the controls of the data and the vendor only uses it for authorized purposes or what was intended to do with that data. So that's super important. Like this is probably one of the most important things. There is an exception. That's why we have CRMs and that's why we have cloud platforms and all this. And under those contracts it spells out we're only going to use the data for intended purposes and so on and so forth.
Yep. So the way to think about it is the student record, it's under the system of the university, and the system of the university can grandfather that to their networks, to the vendors. And that allows institutions like us, partners like us, to come and be an extension. But then I think you're also saying we vendors are on the hook for the same FERPA responsibilities, right? And that's basically the punchline here. All right.
Yeah. And look, at the end of the day, like because we interact with this sensitive data, like we have a lot of clauses in our contracts and how we
Sure.
handle that data and kind of the security and everything that we go through around that. All right. So now let's move on to kind of the vendor contracts and data use policies for FERPA compliance, right? Let's move on to the vendor side. So one of the most important aspects of FERPA compliance is ensuring that these first party vendors or partners, whatever we want to call, are handling data that adheres to strict contractual obligations. So higher ed institutions must really ensure that the processing of student records meet those conditions. And let's go through them, right? So contracts must clearly outline that the vendor acts as a school official and is bound by FERPA. So like we have a clause in our contract that says we comply with FERPA and vendors must not use student records for any purposes outside the scope of that contract. So that's very, very clear.
You stay in your lane. The vendor stays on their lane on the services agreement. Yeah.
Correct. So the second one is around data access and control. So institutions must retain full control over how student data is accessed and used. So when you're working with vendors, they should provide granular access control, allowing for institutions to define roles and permissions. So when you're working with student data, you have to make sure that those communications, depending on who they are, you have the controls in place to have things like communications be with a counselor to be separated from communications with an advisor, with a faculty member. So you need fine-grained controls. And this is one of the things that we've kind of been very, very good about in adding more and more and more granular controls in here.
Yeah. An important application of this is when your technology providers and vendors and your own technology allows you to see certain fields or meet certain numbers, like in social securities. Notes that you take are not visible to everybody. The usual when you pass the record, admissions record to the registrar's office, how certain things are omitted, all that kind of flow. It's basically in title of this aspect of the access and control.
When we think about AI, it's that no data retention or for AI training. This is a big one. So vendors should not use student data to train AI models. So all AI processes must comply with the data minimization principles, which means that you should use as much of it as possible or remove PII information if you're going to use certain things. So ensuring that only necessary data is accessed as well. So this no training part on student data is really important. So unless you have specific access from, from the school and you're using that model specifically for that school, you're not allowed to train on school X and then use it for school Y. So be very careful around, those clauses around that. The other one is around data security measures. So contracts should require vendors to have, obviously encryption, both transit and arrest, things like multi-factor authentication and access logging to track data interaction. So like who's logging into the system, who's not, and so on and so forth. This idea of data deletion, so data deletion and retention policies. So institutions should really have the ability to request data deletion at any time, and vendors must really comply with that. Specific data retention policies defined by the contracts. We have specifically clauses in there that we delete all of our data within X amount of time after the contract ends. Even if you come back to us as a customer, we just don't have that data anymore. So it's like all of those pieces have to be in place. The last one, which is probably one of the most important things, is how do you know that you're working with a vendor that kind of has all the data security and all the data compliance, data audits and compliance monitoring in place, right? So you have to ensure that they comply with security and privacy standards for FERPA. But then you should also mandate that they undergo regular security audits and compliance reviews verified by, third-party entities, right? And one of the strongest indicators of security compliance is having a SOC 2 Type 2 certification, which is kind of the gold standard right now for any SaaS, product or company right there. So it really demonstrates that adheres to industry standards, for data security, availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, and privacy. And institutions have the right to conduct independent security audits on their own as well, review compliance reports. So you should be able to receive the full SOC 2 Type 2 report. Sometimes it's required an NDA because there's sensitive information in there, but you can have access to that and you can require it. So really the level of oversight ensures that those student records remain secure, protected, and don't have unauthorized kind of access.
So, as you recap FERPA, right, through the lens of this is what it entails for the vendor, right, from audits and how to think about retention and security and training of models, access, compliance, all that good stuff. This is where I can start seeing the layer of AI emerging, right? Because one of the things that happens is you just kind of walk us through what FERPA is. But then the angle that we want to bring is what does AI do or doesn't do to amplify, omit, and sustain this? And then I think it's a really interesting
Yeah.
opportunity. So can we start going into the AI layer in FERPA and how this kind of they collide? But I can totally see the connections here.
Yeah, look, I mean, the tools that we use today, they provide unparalleled efficiency, right? Really personalization, but they also introduce a lot of compliance risk, right? If not implemented correctly. So some of the common AI related FERPA concerns can be chatbots and AI assistants and how they're handling student data. So number one. So if you think about institutions, they must ensure that AI powered chatbots do not disclose student specific information unless users are verified and authorized. So AI driven responses, they must adhere to the role based access permissions, just like any other human advisor would. So when you think about it, it's like you have all these permissions around your data, but then, when a chatbot answers and asks questions, it's like it needs to check those permissions. So building on a foundation where the layer you have all those access controls and the chatbot or the AI being on top of that usually alleviates those.
Yeah. Can I just go there? A good bot it's able to draw information and make connections from the different silos of the university, right? So we're thinking about financial aid, gets a layer of mental health and maybe academic success, right? And all of a sudden, without that layer of user authentication, mom and pops can come and say, hey, I'm Johnny. How am I doing in class? And the chatbot will have all the ability to comment, break FERPA in the sense of disclosing and not providing the privacy that the student requires. So it's a really, really important one. And we just need to be aware that role-based access permissions it's a foundational core on good AI bots today.
Exactly, 100%. The second one is around AI powered marketing and personalization, right? And sometimes AI generates student communications and often involves those personalization outreach and which are based on student profiles. And this is really where a lot of folks are really careful, or this is perhaps one of the biggest points where it's like, well, I can't upload my data to ChatGPT because, they might not be compliant. They're going to retain the data. They're going to train on that data. And now you just broke FERPA law because you provided it to an entity that does not comply with that FERPA laws, right? And of course, that's what people mean by that, right? It's like you're breaking that rule because you want to personalize communications and you're uploading PII information in there. So FERPA protects non-directory student data. It's not just the first name and last name. Those are fine, right? Those are directory level data, and there's an exception for that. But non-directory, like grades, financial aid status. So if you're doing data analysis, for example, like that's an area where you got to be really careful to use tools that are FERPA compliant, right? And it really means that AI must never access or use this data without proper authorization, meaning that the student hasn't given you access, and then if that chatbot, you're using it your personal account, or you're not using the enterprise version where it's not being retained, and so on and so forth. Like those are the things that you have to be careful about. You can't put that data into different places without knowing, like what's the relationship with your institution and that particular provider, if it's FERPA compliant or not.
Ardis, that's a good one. Let me expand that with an example, and I like to hear what it's FERPA compliant and how AI it's walking a fine line here. So I created a campaign based on scholastic achievement, aka GPAs, right? So I load dozens, hundreds of students and their GPA in a one tool, basically add a AI to give me the best way to engage someone with a 4.0, someone with a 3.0, someone with a 2.0. That seems to be an issue based on the description of AI powered FAIRPA.
Well, no. So again, the use case is not the problem here. So you can use that. However, the relationship between that tool that you're putting that data in and the institution has to be, so it has to be a school official relationship.
So unless my university has a contract with Element, obviously, right, they're not going to have access to it. But let's think
Correct.
about my university doesn't have a contract with OpenAI. So can I use ChatGPT to give me recommendations on how to build a campaign?
The answer is no, because that goes against FERPA. You're disclosing information to an entity that is not authorized to access that information.
Mm-hmm.
And you do not have a contractual relationship with them in order for them to do that. So that's the key point here, is not the use case itself, is that where you put that data on that AI tool, are they have a contractual obligation to you
Yeah.
to comply with FERPA or not.
Yep. Let's go to the next one.
Yeah. So this is around AI training and data use. Again, one of the things, it kind of piggybacks on what we're just talking about. So some AI models, they store and use user interactions for training, which can lead to unauthorized retention of student records. So when you use the ChatGPT, the paid version, there is a little toggle in there that says, use my data, or do not use my data, or do not retain my data for training. And sometimes they still retain your data for 30 days, and then you only have to go to an enterprise or an API or some other relationship where there's zero retention at all, right? So you have to be careful on on that. Even though you have a paid version, you have to make sure that you check off that box for training, and like you read the fine print around the use of that data that you have in there. So institutions might really confirm that the AI tool do not use student data to improve third-party AI models. Does that make sense?
But there's a caveat. Right? So obviously, it makes a lot of sense, everybody. When you're using the solution, specifically like ChatGPT, make sure that you toggle for not volunteering this data to be part of their big element. However, if in your solution,
You don't have that option on the free version, right? Even on the paid version, it's by default, it's turned on.
but in your solution, let's say that your campus is a Google campus. So you basically contracted all the Google suite. If there is a Gemini type of training, it could be fine that the data is moving and informing the LLM because it's a kind of paid wall LLM that remains within your campus. And that's totally fair game. So I just want to make that distinction, right?
Yeah, yeah. All right. So the last one is around data security and authorized access. So institutions are responsible for ensuring that student records are secure, and accessible only to authorized users. So these AI solutions might provide, again, full data visibility, like chat history, what's happening. So if you're using an AI chatbot that is not showing you the history of that, or it's behind the scenes, and then there's an audit or there's a log of all those interactions, you need to be able to see all of that, because that's your responsibility, right? Now, maybe we can spend like a couple of minutes on how we think about it at Element, and kind of the full compliance that we have here. And maybe that's a kind of blueprint for how other folks are supposed to evaluate other providers or other AI vendors as well. So here at Element, we built our AI CRM to comply fully with FERPA, right? Security and institutional controls at the foundation. So when we think about compliance, we start with SOC 2 Type 2 compliant, right? So third-party security Element is SOC 2 Type 2 compliant. We are verified and have audits by third-party entities for data security and privacy standards. That's the gold standard. Data encryption. All student records are encrypted both in transit and at rest. Some additional fields are encrypted even further than that. So it really protects unauthorized access. Multi-factor authentication. We've added that so institutions really can enforce this multi-factor authentication. There's been a lot of hacking, and right now it's really, really easy to do that. So multi-factor authentication is key and adds this extra layer of security. AI chatbot that verifies your identity, right? So this is one of the biggest things. It's like people are like, well, I see the chatbot in there. Is it going to give me data if I ask it that I'm this student? The answer is no. So before sharing any personal information, our AI assistants, they authenticate users to ensure only authorized individuals can access that student data. Meaning that, if that student says, hey, I'm Johnny, we will ask them for their email address or their phone number that's in the system, so we can verify it's the right person, and then we'll send them a notification to that identity, and then they have to provide us with the code, or they have to provide the bot with the code, and that goes through that identification loop. No student data is used for training, so we don't train on user data, meaning that we use that different techniques, but we don't create specialized models for this stuff, right? So we use a lot of other techniques, but the models that they don't retain student data. And if we do any training on like predictive, it's only based on activity data, which is anonymized and it's generated by our system. Institutions have full control, so they can delete the data anytime they want, and they have visibility to all the student records, including all the conversations they're having with the bots and so on and so forth. And last, the most important thing is that really the AI inherits the institutional security policies and kind of groups and controls that they have added. So permissions and everything else. So these AI assistants, they're built on the secure platform and respect the institutional access control settings that the school has set in Element. So those are kind of the things that we try to communicate to our partners, and we've put in place in here to kind of comply with FERPA. And of course, the biggest thing is contractually in our contracts, we specifically call out all of these things, right? And we don't our data policy and how we comply with all of that.
Look, I love this. In terms of recap, always great to remember what FERPA stems from, what it's intended to do, see the layer of AI and the potential pitfalls. But more importantly, I'm excited about this potential blog that it's coming out that gives the scaffolding of how Element and anybody else should be thinking about this. So as a blueprint of AI, FERPA, symbiosis and compliance, it's a good one. So thanks for this walkthrough, Ardis, as always.
Of course. Yeah. Anytime we have a chance to, if there is any other topics that everybody wants to understand a little bit more about, we're happy to kind of bring them into the show and demystify them. But this is an important one because it builds a lot of that trust, and there's a lot of misinformation or kind of misunderstanding around these things. So we want to make sure that you have all the right information. Till next time, everybody, rate us, review us. We're here. Let us know what you want to hear more about. And until next time.
Thank you, everybody.
Generation AI is part of the Enrollify podcast network. If you like this podcast, chances are you're going to like other Enrollify shows too. Our podcast network is growing weekly, and we've got a wide range of marketing, enrollment, and higher ed technology shows that are jam-packed with stories, ideas, and frameworks, all designed to empower you to be a better higher ed professional. Our shows help higher ed leaders and professionals like you find their next big idea. They feature a selection of the industry's best as your hosts, like Jamie Hunt, Seth Odell, Jenny Lee Fowler, Brian Gross, and many of your favorite leaders in higher ed. Enrollify is made possible by Element 451, the next generation AI student engagement platform that's helping institutions all over the country create meaningful, personalized, and engaging connections with their prospects and students. Learn more at element451.com.